Why are many Muslims so concerned about politics? And let me just say, you'll see that the fourth question is about Christian and Muslim beliefs. So for the next 15 minutes or so, we're going to be thinking about history and politics. At the very end, we're thinking more about what we believe. Here, I'm going to try and do the impossible. I'm going to try and give you a bird's eye view of 14 centuries of Christian-Muslim relations. But if you want to understand some of these things that are going on in the world today, you have to get some idea of the importance of the history. So we begin with, first of all, Muhammad, prophet and statesman. As I said, Muhammad was born around 570 AD. He was called to be a prophet in 610. For 12 years or so, in Mecca, where he was born, he preached the message of Islam and he gathered round him a group of disciples. But they were persecuted. They were powerless. So life was really very, very difficult for him in those first 12 years. Then he had an invitation from some people who had become Muslims in Medina to the north. Here's Mecca down here. Here's Mecca and here's Medina. These people who had converted to Islam invited Muhammad the Prophet to leave Mecca and come to Medina and establish himself as the ruler of the whole community there. Now this event, this move from Mecca to Medina, is called the Hijrah, the migration, and it is the most important event in the life of Muhammad, and their calendar is dated from the Hijrah, the migration from Mecca to Medina. In Mecca, he's been a prophet only. Now in Medina, he's the prophet and the statesman. He not only receives the revelations from God, he leads them out to battle, he gives them the laws to govern every aspect of their life as a community. Now, one of the reasons why this is important is that Muslims look back to the life of Muhammad as a kind of golden age. And they look back to the first Islamic state in Medina as a kind of model, a kind of golden age, a kind of ideal. And so for most Muslims, the ideal situation to be living in is to be living in an Islamic state where the law of the land is the Sharia, the law that was given by God. Okay, are you with me so far? Do you see the significance of the Hijrah and of Muhammad being both prophet and statesman? Then we have Islamic empires. What was the year of the death of the Prophet? 632. So immediately after the death of the Prophet, the Muslim armies pour out of Arabia and they conquer the whole of the Middle East. They go right to the northwest frontier and they go even to the borders of China. They go right across North Africa and cross into Spain at where? Gibraltar, which is named after the Muslim general, into Spain, and they were checked in 732 at the Battle of Tours or Poitiers. And if you remember the name of the hero who beat the Muslim armies? Charles Martel. Now, notice the date, 732, exactly 100 years after the death of the Prophet. So, in that 100 years, there is a great Islamic empire that stretches from France and Spain and Morocco right across North Africa, right to the borders of China and northwest India. Now, again, this is a kind of golden age that Muslims look back to. And they look back to the dynasty that ruled in Damascus, the Umayyad dynasty, and the Abbasid dynasty that ruled in Baghdad for many centuries. And one of the reasons why the Americans sending their soldiers and the British sending their soldiers to Iraq was so difficult for Muslims was because of those many centuries of Islamic rule in Baghdad and in Iraq. Then later we have the Safavid dynasty in Persia, we have the Mughal dynasty in India, and we have the Ottoman Empire based in Constantinople. For 400 years, from the 16th century till 1918, the Ottoman Empire, the whole of the Balkans, the whole of Turkey, the whole of the Middle East, and up to about Tunisia. Now, when the Muslims first conquered the Middle East, we had a situation where a few thousand Muslim Arabs were ruling over a population that was largely Christian. This is quite important to try and get hold of this. And I sometimes compare it to the British Raj in India. A few thousand white Brits were ruling a whole continent. Similarly, a few thousand Muslim Arabs were ruling over this vast area, the whole of North Africa, Egypt, the Middle East, largely Christian. Then we come to the Crusades from 1096 to 1291. A period of 200 years, and you remember the Pope calling for the Crusades in order to win back the holy places in Jerusalem from the Muslim rulers, and to make it easier for Christian pilgrims to go to and fro. Now, at the time, the Muslims didn't see this in terms of a religious war. But as Muslims in the 20th century look back to what happened then, they see the Crusades as the Christian West waging war against the Muslim East. And for many Muslims, what has happened in the 20th century, in the 21st century, is a repeat of the Crusades. America, Europe, Britain, the so-called Christian West, making war against the Muslim world in Iraq and Afghanistan and so on. Western imperialism. The point I want to make here is that for a period of about 200 years, the whole of the Muslim world, from Morocco in the west to Indonesia in the east, the whole of the Muslim world came under Western imperial colonial rule in one form or another, except Arabia, Turkey, Iran, and Afghanistan. But even in these countries, the West was constantly meddling. Britain has got itself a very bloody nose when it sent soldiers into Afghanistan in the 19th century. And Britain was interfering in all sorts of different ways, through economically and politically in Iran. So even in these countries that weren't actually controlled by the West was very, very much involved, interfering politically. Now, just try to understand what that must have felt like for Muslims. It's fine for us Muslims to be ruling over these Christians, as we have for so many centuries. But it doesn't feel right when they rule over us. Do you get the point? And Muslims still talk about the post-colonial trauma that they've experienced. One of the things that I think we have to say to them is, look, we're not the only imperialists. You've been at it as well. You've had your own empires. So we're not the only imperialists. And then independence and new forms of imperialism. Of course, the Raj came to the end in 1947. And Libya, there was a very bloody war to get rid of the Italians, and Algeria as well, fighting, hundreds of thousands of people killed in order to win independence from France. So, yes, they've all gained their independence, and there are nation states here, there, and everywhere. But from their point of view, the old kind of imperialism has been replaced by newer forms of imperialism, economic, cultural, political, which from their point of view are just as deadly and pernicious as the old imperialism. They would say America controls the United Nations, the International Monetary Fund. We control the rules for world trade, and. So, from the point of view of many people in the Muslim world, the old imperialism has been replaced with newer forms of imperialism, and they're not very happy. Now, can you see what I've been trying to do? To give you a bird's eye view of the history, to try and help you to understand something of the anger that led to 9/11, for example. So, just one or two things about various issues. Israel-Palestine. You remember Israel was created in 1948. Then in 1967, in the Six-Day War, Israel took over the whole of the West Bank and Gaza and the Golan Heights. The United Nations passed a resolution in November that year calling them to withdraw from the occupied territories. They have refused to do so. So most people in the world today believe that Israel's continuing occupation of the West Bank and all the settlements, not some of them, all of them, are illegal. And for many Muslims, the Israel-Palestine question is at the top of their list of grievances. How can the West possibly allow this illegal occupation to go on and on and on? Al-Qaeda and 9/11. One of the things that made Osama bin Laden angry was American bases in Saudi Arabia and the Gulf. He was angry about Muslim rulers who cooperated with the West, Saudi Arabia in particular, and Mubarak and others. And he felt that they weren't Islamic enough. Yes, they were practicing Muslims perhaps, but they weren't following Islamic principles in their politics. So that was all part of the anger that expressed itself in 9/11, Afghanistan and Iraq. Many Muslims would say that the motive for fighting the war in Iraq was, yes, to get rid of Saddam Hussein, but the main reason for it was to preserve American power in the Middle East and to safeguard oil supplies for the West. I'm trying to put myself, you see, in their shoes. You remember that lovely line from Burns, "O would some powers the gift to gie us, to see yourselves as others see us." I'm trying to help you to see how many people in the Muslim world see us. And the Arab Spring. Here are people in Tunisia and in Egypt who are saying we've had enough of corruption. We've had enough of dictatorship. We've had enough of the secret police. Do you know that in Syria it's reckoned that 1 person in 4 is in the pay of the secret police. So if I was speaking to a group like this in Syria, 1 in 4 of you would be reporting to the secret police every word that I'm saying. Torture. We've heard of people being tortured in prison and so on. So this has been a spontaneous explosion of anger and young people saying we want to hold our heads high, we want to have some say in the way that we're governed, and we want to get rid of these corrupt and oppressive dictatorships. And the last point here is Muslims as minorities in pluralist societies. And the point to note here is that approximately 25% of Muslims all over the world are living in situations where they are a minority, as in this country, Europe, the United States, and India too, they're a minority. Remember I said that for Muslims the ideal situation is to be in a what? An Islamic state, where you're the majority, you've got power. Here are situations, so 1 Muslim in 4 in the world is in a situation where they are a minority. And they've got to learn how to live in a very different way, to adapt. Does that give you any way of understanding why some Muslims are angry and why some of them are involved in political processes and why some of them take up weapons? Questions, comments, please.
David, mic's on its way, David.
In the light of Western support, well, especially our country, France, of Libya, that it's been handled in such a different way. This, and with the Arab League's approval, or support, or request even, this must be, in the light of what you've said, must be very puzzling to them, as it seems a different stance. What do you say?
First point is, who is them? Is it the Libyans or Muslims in general?
Muslims in general, I think, as they observe from elsewhere in other countries.
Yes. Well, I think they would probably recognize that America and the EU in particular have realized what an awful mess we made of Iraq.
Yeah.
And we've been determined not to repeat those same mistakes. At the same time, I think we have to say that most people feel very ambivalent about what has happened in Libya. And I suspect that the NATO went way beyond what they were allowed to do by the United Nations Security Council. On the other hand, if they hadn't had that kind of aerial support and the bombardment and so on, the rebels would never have been able to take over the country. And remember, there have been situations where the West has come in on the side of Muslims in Bosnia some years ago.
Yes.
But we also have to say that for some Muslims, they're still suspicious of the West because we've got our ulterior motives. Don't we want a share of the oil? Yeah. Don't we want to send in our engineers to get some work in Libya? Yes. And France in particular wants to get contracts as a reward for the bombing. Yes. It's very complicated and messy.
Politics is messy, isn't it?
Yes.
Other questions? Jane Kohler, a couple up from David.
With the Arab Spring, we've watched Tunisia blowing up and the leader being ousted. Then we went to Egypt and Mubarak has been ousted. Now we go to Libya and Muammar Gaddafi's taking a long time to be ousted, but then you go up to Syria and the people of Syria are trying to get rid of Assad. Is it an internecine struggle? It's not against the West, it's against their own society, is it not?
It is, and I think that this is where we have to say that there are certain factors in common in all these countries, but all of these countries are very, very different because of their history, because of the colonial past, because of the relationships between Sunnis and Shiites and so on. So it's very dangerous to generalize. In Tunisia, I think I'm right in saying that there's going to be elections next month or so. but the jury is still out. It's still very difficult to see what is going to take the place of what has been swept aside. And there's a huge struggle going on between moderate Muslims and more Islamist Muslims who want to have a much more clearly Islamic agenda in politics. In Egypt, Mubarak has been kicked out, yes, but many people feel the army is still totally in control. And just last Sunday we had this horrible news of 26 Christians killed in demonstrations. And what some people are afraid of in Egypt is that there is developing a kind of alliance between the army on the one hand and the Muslim Brotherhood on the other. So it's you know, we have to watch this space, and it's very difficult to see how it's actually going to turn out in the end. And Syria is complicated again, because the Assad regime, as I said earlier, is Alawite. The Alawites are 10% of the population of Syria, so they're a minority. But the Assad family have created this kind of police state, this dictatorship with very vicious secret police and all that. The Sunnis are furious because they've been kept out of power for 40, 50 years. And the Christians are in a very, very sensitive situation because they're also about 10% of the population in Syria. And the Christians actually feel that they've been in a favored position because the Alawite minority has been very sympathetic to the Christian minority. And if the Assad regime is brushed aside and something more Islamic takes its place, the Christians might find themselves in a very bad position because of the way they have been identified with Assad and his regime. So every country is different, and it's very complicated and still too early to see what's going to come out of this so-called spring.
We were quite interested in our prayer group to find on the internet some sort of message from a priest at the Church of Christ the King in Tripoli. He said, Christ is shaking the Middle East, and
yes.
We must keep praying.
Yes. I'd been to that church in Tripoli and spoken there, and it's right in the heart of the city. Can we go on to the last...
Good, move on.